This episode of The Energy Show is proudly sponsored by Sunlight and Power, the Bay Area's leading commercial and residential solar contractor. SLP has been designing and installing photovoltaic, battery backup, and solar thermal solutions since 1976. Help fight climate change. Go solar with Sunlight and Power today.
So, you want to save the world with clean energy? Make money doing it? Confused about the economic and technical realities of residential and commercial solar, batteries, heat pumps, EVs? Want the real-world scoop on new energy technologies, not manufacturer hype? Then tune in to the weekly Energy Show, hosted by Barry Cinnamon. Insights from Barry's 40-plus years in the solar and energy industry will help you understand the future ways we'll generate and consume energy. And now, here's Barry.
Welcome to this week's Energy Show. Now, heat pump water heaters and heat pump HVAC systems seem to be poised to take over the world. Every building is going to have their water heated with a heat pump and air conditioning and heating done with a heat pump. But when I kind of talk to people in my experience in dealing with a lot of customers and products that are out there and how they match for what people are looking for, I could kind of come up with 5 reasonable reasons, actually 4 reasonable reasons and 1 unreasonable, get into that later, but 5 reasons why it might not be the best thing for you to install a heat pump HVAC system or a heat pump water heater system. So here they are. Here are the 5 reasons. First, maybe you don't believe in global warming and prefer to burn fossil fuels. There's a lot of people that take that attitude. Reason 2, heat pumps are too expensive. Reason 3, it's too complicated to install a heat pump system. Reason 4, I rent a house or plan to move. And reason 5, my existing HVAC and water heater is working just fine. So 80% of those are logical reasons why it might not make sense to go ahead with it. So as we dive into this, let's kind of get a little bit of specific technical background about heat pump systems. I'm going to start off with heat pump HVAC systems. You can see this picture over here. And so a heat pump HVAC system is basically an air conditioner in the summer, and it operates in reverse in the winter. So when it's in heating mode in the winter, it blows warm air into the house, and outside where the compressor unit is, you got colder air coming off. And these new heat pump systems, they work even in very cold climate. The state of Maine is standardizing on them. And you've got temperatures in Maine that are regularly down below 10 degrees Fahrenheit. You can also, if you're in a super cold place, super cold, let's say 50th state up in Alaska, you can get backup heat, you can get a hybrid system with gas, but in most cases, just a pure heat pump system is going to be good enough. And these systems have a very high efficiency. Now, technically, from an engineering standpoint, you can't have anything with over 100% efficiency. But the basic concept, the efficiency of a heat pump HVAC or a heat pump water heater is between 300 and 400%. Some of them are even higher. And the reason why you can get over the 100% efficiency level is it's pulling warmth. It's pulling warmth out of this cold air. So the air may be 40 degrees outside and you're pulling heat out of that. The vent from the heat pump system might be 30-degree air. So you're actually cooling the air on the outside and you're taking that heat and moving it inside. So with these heat pump systems, heat pump HVAC systems, there's basically 2 fundamental designs. You can use the existing ductwork in the house, or you can use what are called mini splits. So instead of having ductwork going to each vent, they're little split HVAC units that have hot and cold refrigerant lines and a power line, and they are actually going to blow hot or cold air depending on what's needed at the time. So you may go to hotels, they do additions onto the house, and they'll put these mini splits in. They'll either go flush mounted in the ceiling, they look like just a regular vent, or they can go up in the corner of the ceiling and the wall, and you'll see these little rectangular things, and they're just going to blow hot air in the winter and cold air in the summer. In my house, actually, I put in a hybrid system where there's ducts above and ducts below. I replaced all the duct work, and it's just working phenomenally well. So that's the basics for a heat pump HVAC system. For a heat pump water heater, or HPWH, very similar to a regular tank gas or electric water heater. You've got the cylindrical tank. And with gas systems, you've got a gas burner at the bottom. It's like a pot of water on a gas stove. And with electric systems, you have an electric coil inside. So the difference with a heat pump is instead of that gas burner at the bottom or electric coils inside, they put a small refrigeration system at the top. It's like a mini refrigerator, but it's operating in reverse. So the cool thing about it, or the hot thing about it, is that system extracts heat from nearby air and it creates really hot refrigerant. This refrigerant might be 150, 200 degrees, and it pipes that into the water into the tank in coils. It's the heat exchanger, and that warms up the water in the tank. I kind of run my system, usually the hot water is at about 130 degrees. I could go a little bit lower, but that's okay. Sometimes we have the kids over. So that hot refrigerant really heats up the water to whatever temperature you want. And then really the kind of interesting thing is the exhaust from this water heater is cool air. I have one in my garage. So I have cool air kind of in the garage. It's like air conditioning my garage. My wife takes advantage of that because she has her collection of fruits and vegetables, and she has those underneath this air vent. So it's a little cool corner of the garage. But bottom line, I'm spending, and this has been installed for almost 5 years, spending on the average of about $7 a month for all the heating costs for the hot water I have in my house. It's just almost 10 times cheaper. And it's kind of a bummer actually here in Silicon Valley, water is so expensive. I'm spending way more for the water than actually for heating the water. And plus the exhaust air conditions our garage. Okay, so let's get back to the reasons why you don't or you may not want to put in a heat pump system. Reason number one, and this is probably the hardest reason to overcome. Some people don't believe in global warming and prefer to burn fossil fuels. Maybe they're just stubborn. Maybe they don't believe the accepted science. For those people who are still listening to my podcast right now, you probably don't need to listen to the rest of the podcast because I'm not going to convince you. But that's just kind of a fact. Now, there's a little bit of rationale and a little bit of logic in here. It depends on the source of electricity that you're using for your heat pump. If you're using carbon-free electricity, like if your utility has solar or wind farms, then putting in a heat pump is going to reduce the CO2 that's created when that electricity is generated. Taking it a step further, if your house is powered by your own rooftop solar system, it's even better because not only do you have carbon-free electricity, but you have darn cheap carbon-free electricity. I mean, we're putting in systems where the amortized cost of the electricity is something, between 6 and 10 cents a kilowatt hour compared to 66 cents on the peak time of the EV2 rate. Now, if your utility is only generating power with coal, maybe gas too, but coal, then putting in a heat pump is not going to really reduce the CO2 pollution because your electricity is still being generated by coal with a lot of CO2 emissions. So you're putting aside the CO2 emissions in terms of dollars and cents. A heat pump, whether it's heat pump HVAC system, hot and cold air, or whether it's a heat pump water heater, it's almost always cheaper to operate than regular electric appliances and almost always cheaper to operate than a natural gas appliance. That's because these heat pumps operate at 300 to 400% efficiency since they're just moving the heat. They don't just generate the heat. So that's reason number one, probably not going to convince you one way or the other. Reason number two, this is the most common. Heat pumps are too expensive. Yes, they're not cheap. It costs a little bit more to put in a heat pump water heater than a gas hot water heater. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. We'll talk about that. And it costs a little bit more to put in a heat pump HVAC system than just a regular gas furnace or a gas furnace and an air conditioner. Now, if you were to have to replace both the air conditioner and the gas furnace at the same time, I'm pretty sure the heat pump HVAC system is cheaper. But there's some good news. There are tax credits and rebates that are available to help offset these costs. Our favorite are tax credits. And for example, in the IRA, there's a $2,000 tax credit if you install a heat pump HVAC system and if you install a heat pump water heater. These tax credits are easy and they're automatic. It's just great. No hassles. You just say to your accountant, this is what we're doing. Boom. You can get those very, very simply. So we love tax credits. As you know, the solar industry and the battery industry has really been fueled to a very large degree by 30% tax credits. And on commercial systems, you also get accelerated depreciation. Tax credits and depreciation, pretty easy. really no paperwork other than, what has to get done for your taxes. And there's just forms for that, and your accountant can handle that pretty easily. Or, if you're using QuickBooks or any of the TurboTax products, it's all pretty straightforward. Now, in addition to the tax credits, there's a lot of good news, not reality yet, but there's been a lot of good news about rebates that are part of the IRA. So in the Inflation Reduction Act, there's an $8,000 rebate if you install a heat pump HVAC system, and a $1,750 rebate if you install a heat pump water heater system. So in addition to tax credits, you get another $8,000 for HVAC and $1,750 for a water heater. The challenge is these rebates flow from the federal government to the Department of Energy to the state energy offices. So it's not being administered federally. Every single state has to kind of create their own rebate programs and get the money from the DOE, which is where the IRA is funding that money. So the reality is most state energy offices, and certainly the case here in California, they still haven't disclosed their rebate process. They haven't opened this great $8,000 HVAC rebate to the general public. Nobody can get it yet. And it's kind of, I think for some people, it's stalling their installations, but I don't think it really should stall the installations, and I'll tell you why. But these processes are going to be different in every single state. They call them by different names. It's super confusing. So, here we are in California. We're going to know what the deal is in California, but if we were to open up an office, which we're not going to do, in Nevada or Arizona or back in New York or New Jersey or Connecticut, where I used to also work, we would have to really do all these calculations with the nomenclature separately for every state. What a nightmare. It's not standardized. And that's why the tax credits are so easy. There's like no friction with a tax credit. But with these rebates, because we've done a lot of solar installations with rebates going back to 2001, super complicated. There's usually special equipment that's required. So there's a list of equipment that you can use, and there may be the latest and greatest heat pump water heater or heat pump won't be on that list because it hasn't made to the list yet, and then you can't use it. Or if you're installing something old and the construction gets delayed, you may not be able to get the unit for which you applied the rebate, and then you're going to have a problem. So the equipment requirements are not always optimal. But then there's other paperwork involved. So in order for these state rebate programs to make sure that you installed what you said you were going to install when you applied for the rebate, they're almost always going to require a building permit and one or more building inspections, depending on the complexity of the installation. So the filing for and receiving these rebates, it adds a lot of costs. Now, it may not seem that significant to the homeowner, but the contractors are pulling out their hair. You just have separate people that are just doing rebate paperwork and fixing it and doing the pre-application, getting the confirmation of the application, sending in the building permit to collect the check, and then sending that check to the customer. It's complicated. And sometimes it's not worth it. So I'll give you an example. Here in California, there's a $1,750 heat pump water heater rebate. But when we go through the requirements to get that in terms of a building permit, inspections, additional equipment that the local building department may require, it may take another $2,500 of extra work and extra paperwork. We've got to have some pretty capable people to do this. And so you're spending $2,500 to save $1,750. It's a losing proposition. You're better off just skipping the rebate. And that same thing happened in California when the solar rebates got so low. They weren't de minimis. And when the energy storage rebates got low, down to $1,000 or $2,000, it's like, it's not worth going through the brain damage of all this paperwork just to get that, because it's going to just take more administrative costs and hassles. And then finally, one of the limitations of the IRA rebates, and I love the concept of the IRA, but where the rubber meets the road, it's just a little complicated. In order to qualify for these rebates, and the big one is the $8,000 HVAC rebate, homeowners have to have an adjusted gross income that's less than 150% of the local median gross income. And here in expensive Silicon Valley, that means that you have to have an income of less than $250,000 a year. That's a lot of money, but it's just expensive to be here. And there's a lot of our customers, I'd say, unless you're retired or living in a relatively small house, you probably will not qualify for these rebates. So it's kind of tricky. Now, that's the other reason why tax credits are so good. There's no limitation on tax credits. So it's easy and automatic to get those $2,000 tax credits for heat pump HVAC and heat pump water heaters and other energy items. Okay, now, coming back to heat pumps being expensive, you got tax credits that are no-brainers to get. You've got rebates that may or may not make sense. But there's a lot of loan programs that can cover all of the remaining costs. You can borrow money from a credit union, a second mortgage. There's also things called Property Assessed Clean Energy or PACE programs. And all of these programs have pretty good interest rates. Right now it's probably 5% or so, maybe a little bit less. So they're pretty good. There will be government loans, and a lot of these government loan programs also apply for middle and low income customers. And then there's private companies that offer loans and leases too. So there's an abundance of financing options to cover these other heat pump expenses. And it's basically the same way that the solar industry has evolved. There's companies that kind of step in and say, hey, we may not be installers, but we're darn good financiers. And then they'll work with installers. And a lot of the good installers out there know who to partner with to get these good financing programs. Okay, reason number 3. It's too darn complicated to install a heat pump water heater or heat pump HVAC system. Sometimes these systems are just like for like. Just go into the garage, take out that old gas tank, put in the new heat pump water heater, or take out that old gas furnace, which is easily accessible, and take out that old air conditioner, which is just sitting on the side of the house, and replace that equipment and go. Sometimes it's really easy, but sometimes it's complicated. And complicated basically means it's just going to be a little bit more expensive than a really simple installation. So let's kind of break it down both for heat pump water heaters, and then we'll talk about HVAC. So not every single family residence is okay for a heat pump water heater retrofit installation. So you may say, hey, I've got an existing tankless water heater, and that's been pretty popular, especially for compact homes. Sometimes really big homes have those because they want to put 2 or 3 water heaters in. For townhouses, they have a tankless water heater. It's a rectangular box that sits on the side of the house, or it goes, in a utility room somewhere. And it doesn't take up much space, but unfortunately, in the locations where those tankless water heaters are, there's not enough room to put in a tank. These tanks are typically 24 inches wide, and they may be 3 or 4 feet high, and there's just no room. They use the tankless water heaters to save space. And if you want to put in a heat pump water heater, you're going to need more space. So if you have a tankless water heater, it's generally pretty tough to put in a heat pump water heater. There are some companies and contractors that have installed these heat pump water heaters outdoors, but I would generally be very careful about making sure you're doing that, because there are high and low temperature limitations that these heat pump water heaters have that you have to make sure that you're not exceeding. So basically, if you have an existing tankless water heater, you really want to work with a heat pump contractor that knows it's not going to try and sell you something that's going to be kind of clunky and not going to work out really well. So now let's talk about heat pump heating systems. The most common heating systems and the ones that are easiest are the systems that use existing ductwork. But there are a lot of homes that are using what's called hydronic floor heating. They basically have pipes in the floor. It makes a nice, cozy, warm floor. So you have to heat a lot of hot water. That's kind of a little bit of a newer generation of heat pump. There are heat pumps that basically will heat this water like a heat pump water heater, but it's heating a lot of water at a lower temperature that's ideally used for heating the home or heating the floors. That's an air-to-water heat pump, and they exist. They're a little bit newer, not as popular yet. And there are also companies that are starting to sell ground couple heat pump systems. And those, when ground coupled, basically means you've got these heat exchanger pipes that are buried 3 or 4 or 5 feet underground outdoors, where the temperature of the ground is usually pretty stable. It's around 55 degrees. So you can actually, on a cold winter day when it might be 10 degrees outside, you're extracting heat from the ground, which might be only around 55 degrees. It's funny because my second job out of college after the solar startup that I was working for tanked was developing the first ground-coupled heat pump. It's something called a geopump with a company called Megatech. This goes back to 1982. But it was a good concept, and it's something that some companies are starting to run with now. But if that's the kind of system you have, a hydronic floor heating system, a little bit trickier to find a heat pump system that would actually heat and cool your house. Now, with the more standard heat pump HVAC systems, which usually are replacing ductwork, if you're putting in a brand new high-efficiency heat pump HVAC system and you have a 50 or 60-year-old house, which was the case that I had, it's kind of pointless to put in a super efficient system and then you have 50-year-old leaky ducts. So You want to make sure you're working with a contractor that's going to inspect the ducts and make sure that they're going to be sealed and well insulated before you go ahead. And there will be an extra cost if you have to replace some of that ductwork. Not that big a deal. It's just going to be an extra cost. And it's very, very common. And I'd say if your existing ductwork is much over 30 or 40 years, you definitely want to replace it. The new ductwork is going to be much better insulated. You're not going to have leaks. And it's very hard to kind of fix this old ductwork. And in fact, in order to get inspections done in some places like here in California, you need to actually have some testing of the ductwork that's used with the system to make sure it's not leaking. Good idea, actually. Now, the other alternative, if you don't want to mess with your ductwork, or if you just want to heat and cool a few rooms, let's say you put an addition onto the house, or you're planning on that, you don't want to run new ductwork to it, you can put in these things called mini split systems. And they're pretty popular. Coming back to the graph that we showed earlier on, those are the little rectangular boxes that are near the ceiling of the room or flush mounted, and they will basically blow hot air in the winter and cold air in the summer, and there's a little thermostat or a remote control that control it. Really, really easy. So you don't need to worry about ductwork. And then kind of the third is a hybrid option. Maybe you're going to be using new or existing ductwork for your ground floor of your house, and maybe you're going to be using mini splits for the upper floor. And these heat pump compressor units, actually, many of them can support both at the same time. So that's kind of cool. That's what I have at my house. I have new ductwork in the attic, also new ductwork in the crawl space with two different thermostats, and I can kind of keep those two zones separate. And during the day, I let them coast. Whatever temperature goes up in the summer, goes down in the winter. And before we get home, the thermostat goes on, and it kind of gets everything comfortable. So there's always going to be room for that heat pump compressor unit. Usually, for most systems, it's replacing the existing air conditioner compressor unit, and the heat pump systems are usually more compact than the existing air conditioner compressor. But then there's a lot of new systems where basically they're little rectangular boxes. It's like a white box with a big fan on it, and it just hangs on the wall, taking up effectively zero space. So lots of options. And so you want to work with contractors that are kind of accustomed to this, and also keep in mind, if it's complicated, just maybe a little bit more expensive, that just makes it more important to seek out a good contractor and look for the right incentives that are going to make sense for you. Okay, reason number 4. I rent my house, or I plan to move in a few years. That's a good reason. Why should you spend a ton of money if you're planning on moving in a few years? You may want to talk to a realtor and find out if it makes sense to make that improvement. Sometimes it does make sense to make that home improvement, but a lot of times, why sink in, $10,000 or $20,000 into the house if you're not sure you're going to get the money back in terms of the sale of the house? So that's a good question. And if you rent a house, maybe your landlord's one of those really great 1 in a million landlords that's happy to make improvements, but generally landlords are cheap. And they're not going to want to make expensive improvements, especially since the landlords don't usually pay the utility bill. So, why would they bother? So this reason number 4, I rent or plan to move, good reason why you may not want to be considering a heat pump right now. And then finally, reason number 5, my existing HVAC system and water heater are working just fine, and those are darn good reasons. The most cost-effective way to make this upgrade decision is to replace the equipment when the existing equipment fails, when it's too old, when it breaks. That's what I did for my house. I had a perfectly good gas furnace, but in May, when I turned the air conditioner on a first warm day, it's like nothing. It was old, and I could probably have gotten it repaired. But I figured, at this point, let's just bite the bullet. And 5 years ago, I said I want to really understand and learn about these heat pump things, and greatest decision. And keeping in mind, as you replace that existing HVAC system or water heater, you're going to end up with something in terms of HVAC that's more comfortable. And it's also good not to have as many of those gas flames around. So you're definitely safer with an electric heat pump water heater or electric heat pump for HVAC. You're not burning gas. There's no pilot light. It's a lot safer, and there's no emissions. So my advice is plan for installing a heat pump water heater, which may mean making sure that you have the right size electrical service and make sure you have an outlet there, and plan for upgrading to a heat pump HVAC system. When your existing equipment dies or is about to die, that's when you want to pull the trigger, because you don't want to wait a while and find out, oh heck, now I got to go find an electrician that's going to upgrade the electrical for my heat pump water heater. There's lots of good options there, but just plan for it, because it does take probably a few more days to put in these heat pump systems than just, basically a like-for-like replacement of a dead gas water heater for a new gas water heater. Okay, so just wrapping up here, when I kind of reflect over these reasons, the only good reasons not to get a heat pump are if you plan to move, or if you're renting, or if your existing HVAC system and hot water heater are in good shape. I'm not a pushy salesman. I'm not saying you should do it now, but that's certainly when the systems die, that's when you want to replace it. With the tax credits, with the rebates, and with the loans, almost all heat pump systems are affordable, and they don't cost that much more, if at all, compared to inefficient gas or plain electric systems, and you're going to save money because they operate much more efficiently, and they're certainly better in terms of safety and comfort. Now, if you don't believe in heat pumps, if you don't believe in global warming, if you want to burn as much gas as you want, I'm not going to try and change your mind if you don't believe the science, but you're missing out on a new generation of appliances that are going to save you money, be safer, and be better for your indoor air quality. All right, that's all the time we have on this week's Energy Show. Thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in. And if you missed any of today's show, you can go to the Energy Show website at energyshow.biz, B-I-Z, and listen to the podcasts.
This episode of The Energy Show was proudly sponsored by Sunlight and Power, the Bay Area's leading commercial and residential solar contractor. SLP has been designing and installing photovoltaic, battery backup, and solar thermal solutions since 1976. Help fight climate change. Go solar with Sunlight and Power today.